Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I am the Assistant Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Senior Fellow. It is a pleasure to be here to round out the day's discussion with this panel on cyber crime, cyber war, cyber geopolitics, and the use of social media as weapons. Some housekeeping reminders for those of you who are joining us just now. Please remember to silence your phone. If you have a question, please use the question cards in front of you and raise your card so our staff will pick them up. And finally, we encourage you to engage with online using the hashtags, hashtag ArabCenter2019 and hashtag ArabMedia. And now back to our topic, cyber geopolitics and the weaponization of social media. Building on the conversations throughout the day, this panel will explore the evolving use of social media platforms and new technologies in the political sphere. With the emergence of cyber power, opportunities and risks are presented by new media tools. In the last few years, we've seen those tools used in the political arena, from cyber activism and online mobilization on the positive side of these uses, to espionage, fake news armies, hate speech, and cyber warfare. How are social media platforms and new technologies used and manipulated as tools of war and propaganda? What are the humanitarian costs of cyber conflict? What is the future of human rights and democracy in the region in an increasingly interconnected world? And what policy recommendations and regulations can best counter the misuses of technology and cybercrime laws? To help us understand these phenomena and answer these questions, and probably more questions, we have a great panel of experts this afternoon. I will briefly introduce them in speaking order. Mark Owen Jones is Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University and a Fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Karen Gulo serves as Analyst and Senior Media Relations Specialist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Ryan Grimm, who will be joining us shortly, is the DC Bureau Chief for The Intercept. And Jessica Deer, who serves as the Deputy Director at Ranking Digital Rights, and she's also the co-founder and Executive Director of Social Media Exchange, or SMEX. Their full bios are available in the program book. They all have great accomplishments that we don't have time to go through right now. Each of the panelists will have about 12 minutes to present their remarks, after which we'll take some questions from the audience. Again, please use the cards to write your questions. I would like to start with Mark. Mark, how is propaganda in the Arab world evolving with social media tools? And more specifically, how are fake news armies and Twitter bots changing the political sphere? And I know you've studied specifically the GCC crisis, among other things. How did social media impact the geopolitical dynamics in that context?
Thank you for the, hello. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be in DC. Despite the 14-hour flight, I'm still jet lagged. This is probably my 8th cup of coffee. So I can't be held responsible for my actions. Kidding. Yes, so I'd like to start by talking about some recent news. Yesterday, Twitter announced that they were banning political adverts, to which I say, who cares? And I had this discussion with Karen earlier. Not going to make the slightest bit of difference. All the examples I'm going to talk about now are forms of manipulation, disinformation, fake news that have no bearing on political advertisements. However, they do point to the fact that all sorts of the malicious use on Twitter in the Middle East happens regardless of any political advertisement laws. So I want to start really by saying a little bit about what I do, and then giving some empirical examples, because I think we've been looking a lot at high-level facts here, or high-level issues of the media in the Middle East, and I want to give some pertinent examples. So in addition to some of the other things I do, I describe myself as a bot wrangler, bot wrestler, troll wrestler. I'm one of the people who actually who tries to find or try and prove that these troll and bot armies exist. So you've heard a number of the speakers talk about the various methods of intimidation and harassment, such as trolling and bots. But how do we know they're there? We have to know somehow. We can't take Twitter's word for it. We can't take Facebook's word for it. So what I've done over the past few years is been looking at the rise of largely automated accounts that masquerade as real people in the Arabic-speaking Twitter sphere. And these accounts promote specific discourses, almost exclusively state discourses, on Twitter. The idea being to promote a specific message and drown out another message. So I want to start by giving a couple of examples. I first noticed this phenomenon back in 2016. I was writing I'd finished my PhD writing on political repression in Bahrain, and I noticed that there was in Bahrain at the time, there was a cleric called Isa Qasim, who was living in the village of Daraz, which had been surrounded by police for some time. Eventually the police raided the village and arrested him, and they removed his citizenship. What happened then online was that lots of accounts, ostensibly different in individual accounts, started posting messages like, yes, Isa Qasim is a Shia terrorist. It's good that he's been arrested. And then at one point, I just saw multiple identical tweets from different accounts, and I thought, okay, this is very strange. So I started downloading data from Twitter, and I started seeing thousands and thousands of tweets that were maybe five different tweets, but repeated thousands and thousands of times by thousands and thousands of different accounts. So obviously this was suspicious. So I started pioneering a way of finding that a lot of these tweets, these Twitter accounts, were created on the same day and were tweeting about the same subjects. And they were tweeting in a way that was regular in similar patterns. So it was obvious after a certain point that these anomalies pointed to a automated set of accounts that were tweeting essentially, in this case, anti-Isa Qasim propaganda, and also anti-Shia propaganda. So when I started pursuing this more and more, I found that this network of thousands, and this we're talking about hundreds of thousands of fake accounts at this time, were producing information that promoted a certain Saudi news channel, but also was promoting sectarian hate speech. So these tens and tens of thousands of accounts were producing millions and millions of tweets every week promoting a sectarian discourse. So it became very interesting to me that a lot of the kind of information that people were seeing on Twitter, if they looked at certain keywords, because these accounts were tweeting across different topics, from the war in Yemen to Saudi politics to what was going on in Iran, would have been confronted with kind of very virulently sectarian and oftentimes anti-Semitic rhetoric, all produced by some software code that was promoting all these accounts. Now this was very crude. It was a very crude operation. And this is where my cynical relationship with Twitter began. I had all this data, and I said, okay, well, I knew someone in Twitter I'd met at a conference, so I sent them this report and said, well, here's some data, and they said, thanks, we'll get our team to look into it. I wish they did. And then they got back to me saying, oh yeah, thanks, we suspended 1,800 accounts for spam-like behavior. I was like, well, that's good. What about the hate speech? And I then published that on my blog, and then they got annoyed at me because they said that wasn't for public consumption, that information. I was like, well, you didn't say it was confidential. So I became very aware at this point that Twitter were very sensitive about having this kind of information broadcast. And this is, again, why I'm cynical of Twitter, because the things they say, the things like we're banning political advertising, it's relatively meaningless. And we do not know, and this came up, I think, in Courtney's talk, there's so little transparency about what social media companies do and do not tell us. We really do not know the scale of the disinformation being produced in the whole world, but we can at least say there's a certain amount of scrutiny happening here. You have Zuckerberg being hauled in front of Congress. But in the Middle East, it's a new frontier, it's a Wild West. There does not appear to be any desire for transparency or accountability in the region, which to me makes the problem of disinformation and fake news on social media platforms far worse. And it doesn't end there. There's a couple of other examples that happened after this that, again, made me question the seriousness of Twitter in tackling this problem. I'm going to tell another anecdote that I think is quite telling. I did an investigation into verified Twitter accounts. For those of you who don't know, verification is a form of Twitter acknowledging that you are the person that runs that account. Twitter do not say that they endorse that person. But what I started noticing is there was a account called Gloria Steiner. Now, the name Gloria Steiner might not mean anything to any of you. It might mean something to some of you. It's a verified Twitter account, but the banner headline was like a really kind of patriotic Saudi flag with loads of like, pro-Mohammed bin Salman tweets and just like, thousands and thousands of tweets praising Mohammed bin Salman. And I was like, and the name of the handle was Gloria Steiner, but the name of the account was like Abdulaziz or something. I was like, that's strange. I was like, Gloria, if that is your real name, why are you tweeting so much about Mohammed bin Salman? And this was a verified account, so I thought, this is odd. So I downloaded all the verified accounts on Twitter, which you can do by downloading the followers of the verified account, because Twitter verified account follows all verified, anyway, methodology. But so I went into it, and I started looking at accounts, and there was a lot of them. There was about 330,000. And I identified a subset of accounts that all appeared to be run by people who they didn't claim to be. So not just Gloria Steiner, but one of the most telling examples was a guy called David Schwartz. For those of you who watch the Weather Channel, you might know David Schwartz. He was a weatherman who passed away 2 years ago, sadly. He had an obituary in the New York Times, so he's a well-known person, at least in the USA. He has an obituary in the New York Times, and his account had been hijacked at some point by a Saudi-based entity that was promoting Saudi propaganda. This account had tweeted pro-MBS tweets and tweeted the time of the blockade anti-Qatar tweets. So this is very strange. So I wrote up this investigation where I documented several verified Twitter accounts promoting this disinformation, after which Gloria Steiner and a couple of others had the verification status removed. I was like, fair enough. But to this day, and I think now, I mean, I could be wrong, but I checked last week, Dave Schwartz, although his photo has now been removed and his profile picture has been removed, his account still is verified and the handle is still TWC Dave Schwartz. And I find this phenomenal because it makes me wonder, there's different explanations, like Twitter don't know about this, in which case I think there's a certain degree of negligence on their part about how their platform's being used in the reason. They do know about it, they don't care, which is possible, or they do know about it and they can't do anything about it, which again I think is another reason to be kind of worried, because another aspect of what we've been talking about is not just, we've been focusing a lot on regimes and states and their propaganda, but what we need to be mindful of with companies like Twitter and the other companies that have been mentioned before that aren't social media companies, NSO Group, is that repression is increasingly the work of not states or regimes, but assemblages. We're talking about entities that include states, but also commercial actors, Silicon Valley, surveillance companies that act together and act in with each other to perpetrate these crimes. You know, it's like when you look at a weapons company, we have arms controls for a reason. We also view those arms companies with some, kind of judgment when they sell their wares. And we should be the same with social media companies. But we need to be increasingly mindful that these companies are treated with a kind of kid glove approach. We do not demand, I think, the same kind of transparency and accountability from companies like Twitter and Facebook in the region that we'd expect from other companies, and we need to start doing this. We need to know more about the country-level agreements that companies like Twitter and Facebook have with, say, the government of Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Egypt. Because if you can have your platform operate in these countries, there needs to be some sort of accountability in terms of what they are able to do and what they do. So there's plenty more examples that I could give, and I'm happy to talk about in questions or afterwards. But I just wanted to start with those two things because I think they're very interesting. And what they show us is that these platforms are manipulated in such a way to produce the kind of false illusion of civil society that promotes like Middle Eastern regime propaganda using these Western platforms, and in a way that is done with little censure in the region. It's a kind of Wild West of social media, as I see it. And as far as I can see, the problem doesn't seem to be going away, or it does not seem to be abating. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Next, we have Karen. And speaking of holding tech companies accountable, Karen, can you please touch on the issues of the dangers of mass surveillance and the breaching of privacy rights, but also how freedom of expression is different in the cyberspace and this tricky balance between free speech and hate speech?
Sure. Can you hear me? First, I want to say thanks for inviting me to this forum to talk about these important topics. I want to tell you a little bit about Electronic Frontier Foundation, in case you don't know. We are the leading nonprofit defending digital rights and online free speech on behalf of technology users. Since 1990, EFF has been championing user privacy, free expression, and innovation through impact litigation, policy analysis, grassroots activism, and technology development. And we're a donor-supported organization. The majority of our funding comes from ordinary individuals, and about half of that money comes in the form of donations that are under $10,000. So I think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about will touch on this inherent tension that there is between wanting to rein in hate speech, extremist speech, that is no doubt doing a lot of damage around the world, but also the concept of free expression and the need to retain an internet that allows for free speech and free expression. I mean, the internet is where everybody goes out and goes to speak and give their views and watch cat videos and find community and friends and criticize, parking fines and presidents and bad movies, kings and queens and prime ministers. It's also a place where people go to challenge authority and call for protests and street marches and advocate for change. And what we see is that free speech online is under attack in the United States and around the world because there's increasingly laws and policies that are controlling access to the internet, censoring speech, and invading online privacy through surveillance, like you mentioned. And that is a mechanism to chill speech and silence voices, especially those of journalists, activists, dissidents, racial and religious minorities, LGBTQ communities, and other marginalized groups that have a hard time being heard in the first place. So when we look at adopting laws and principles and policies to rein in hate speech, you have to think of the other side of the equation, and that who else is going to be swept up in those kinds of regulations and laws that are supposed to be stopping hate speech. And I think that it's not as clear-cut as everyone might think, and it's something that we really need to keep in mind. Right now, one of the biggest debates about online speech in the U.S. centers around the question of whether internet platforms and websites should be liable for the speech of their users. The posting of online violent images and extremist creeds has a lot of people focusing on technology, on the delivery mechanism, and there are a lot of calls that websites and platforms should either do a better job of removing the material, or they should face regulation that is going to hold them responsible for it. Right now, U.S. law provides websites with immunity for user-generated speech, and by that I mean, speech on sites that is not directly created by the websites themselves. I'm talking about, comments and Facebook comments, posts, reviews, emails, and things like that. Without this law, which is called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the internet as we know it would not have flourished. The law has allowed social media platforms, cloud storage providers, online marketplaces, blogging sites, ISPs, and email providers to host speech without having to worry about ruinous lawsuits that will crop up for things that people disagree with or things that someone thinks is defamatory, and so on. And it also allows internet platforms to create the rules that they feel like they need to control speech on their websites. I'm talking about like content moderation policies and so forth. Section 230 does not protect internet sites from criminal and civil liability when they've had a direct role in creating the content at issue, or where they're otherwise liable, or where liability is otherwise based on the company's own actions. My colleague, EFF Legal Director Corinne McSherry, was invited to testify at a congressional hearing about Section 230 earlier this month, and as she explained to U.S. lawmakers, she said that expanding liability on online platforms for what users say would just incentivize companies to over-censor user speech in an effort to limit their legal exposure. Voices will be silenced, there's no question about that. And then dismantling or weakening Section 230 would further entrench the big tech players because they're the only ones that could withstand the legal costs of, of increased liability. And smaller startups and companies, social media companies that could be the next big thing for online speech wouldn't be able to risk the legal exposure, and so they wouldn't be able to exist. And less competition means more power for the already powerful and fewer outlets for users to practice online speech. So we see laws around the world that are affecting the ability of people to be able to speak out freely. Cybercrime and counterterrorism laws passed by governments in the Arab world to combat fundamentalist groups and protect national security are often used as a mechanism to stifle unwanted or politically critical speech. An EFF report on speech crackdowns in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia found that protecting the homeland from the threat of terrorism has become a primary justification to shut down unwanted or politically critical online speech. And there's sort of a pattern in that, the authorities identify, the offending online activity, and then they find law, whether it's a law aimed at journalists, like a publications code, or a cybersecurity or counterterrorism law that's aimed at speech, and they and you'll find that political dissenters, journalists, and others will be silenced. They'll be imprisoned or worse, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize is that efforts to try to rein in speech that is hateful often encompasses speech that people just don't, that governments just don't want people to hear. As far as hate speech goes, governments and tech companies have been pursuing strategies to eliminate hate speech that have the unintended consequences of censoring important speech. Bans on hate speech end up corralling not just hate speech, but legitimate efforts to report on hate speech and extremism. We worked with the Syrian Archives and the organization Witness on a report published in May that shows how faulty moderation inadvertently captures and censors vital content, including activism, counter-speech, satire, even evidence of war crimes. Automatic flagging, algorithms, and hashing are used to identify and take down terrorist images. But caught in that net are thousands of Syrian YouTube channels that were publishing videos documenting human rights violations in that country. The terminated social media accounts ranged from documentations of protests in Syria to non-traditional media reporting on violent attacks that did not incite violence or encourage dangerous activities. And similar examples can be seen in Yemen and the Ukraine. Journalists like Egypt's Wael Abbas, who has posted documentation of police brutality and other human rights abuses, has for years experienced censorship at the hands of YouTube and Facebook and all of the Silicon Valley's top companies. His photos and postings have been caught up in this net of opaque and shoddy terms of service and lazy algorithms. So I think I'm running out of time, but I wanted to point out that EFF has been documenting instances where platforms have cracked down on online speech too broadly and have silenced a lot of legitimate speech. We have projects called Tossed Out and onlinecensorship.org. And these track the shortcomings of sloppy content moderation. And we're trying to motivate platforms to modify how they're reviewing accounts. We also back what's called the Santa Clara Principles, and these are a set of just minimum standards that we think that social media companies should be incorporating that where they were required to be more transparent about what they're taking down, why they're taking it down, who motivated them to take down, for example, was it a government flagging or what have you, and then also require them to give users a chance to appeal those decisions and actually have human interaction in trying to appeal them so that their takedowns are not just arbitrarily done and speech removed from the web. I'd be happy to, talk about or give out the URLs for all of this information that I've given, and I really appreciate the time and your attention.
Thank you, Karen. And moving on to Jessica from Ranking Digital Rights. Just building on that, I think social media companies have tremendous power in terms of controlling information and policing information. And we've heard some advocates call for either government regulations over social media companies or asking those tech companies to play a larger role in policing speech, both of which are problematic. What is the policy solution?
Thank you.
In 10, 12 minutes.
in 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you for having me here today. I guess I kind of wanted to start in a slightly different space, but I promise I'll get back to
Sure.
your question. And sort of listening to Mark and Karen, and also to the previous panel where Daoud Kutab asked sort of what's the long-term strategy as we sort of deal with all of these problems that we're confronted with. And I think sort of the key difficulty in your question right now, Tamara, is that we're all struggling even in our so-called democracies with this idea of what do we do with what I think of as sort of an algorithmic public sphere. And what do you do when you have to layer that also on top of sort of the types of repressive and restrictive policy regimes that we see across the Arab region? And so going back to this question of sort of what's the long-term strategy, it's a question that I and my partner, who is Mohammed Najm, who is the executive director of Social Media Exchange right now and is in Beirut and at the protests daily, have sort of discussed at length is like what is the space that we have, and what is a theory of change in a region with so little sort of public space? It's a very difficult kind of problem, and what I keep seeing in tweets from Twitter as people continue to go to the streets in Lebanon is one of the themes that is emerging is that we're reclaiming our public space. For those of you who maybe have never been to Lebanon, there is really not a whole lot of public space. There's not a lot of public parks. There's the Corniche in Beirut. Perhaps in places outside Beirut, there's maybe a little bit more public space, but it's largely, most of it has either been sort of privatized by corrupt interests. The coastline is owned. And a lot of, it's been paved over and developed, and so people really struggle with having a public space. And so there is this sense that people are meeting in parking lots and convening to sort of talk about what should be the way forward, which is, giving a lot of people a lot of excitement about what is perhaps possible. And we're all sort of waiting to see. But this idea of reclaiming public space or reclaiming sort of the public sphere, I think is something that we should be looking at on a regional level, but also on a global level, because we're all using these same platforms. And our public sphere is sort of becoming like, if we're restricted by legislation and the application of that legislation in more repressive regimes, we're also being restricted by the algorithms that are sort of underlying that public sphere. I now work at a place called Ranking Digital Rights, and Ranking Digital Rights is a program that's based in the New America think tank just up the street here. And what we've been doing over the past 5 years is producing an index that provides sort of a detailed, ambitious, but achievable, we think, roadmap for companies in the internet, mobile, and telecommunications sector to improve their respect for human rights online. And the way that we've done that, we say that it's a ranking that we produce, and we have used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights framework as well as the Ruggie Principles, which is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to create a set of indicators that measure companies on their disclosures and public commitments to human rights. These indicators are divided into governance indicators, free expression indicators, and privacy indicators. Because, as we've said many times today, free expression is a fundamental right that is sort of a gateway right to pretty much everything else that we want to do for organizing online. And within free expression, we're starting also to look at access to information, which is incorporated in the right to freedom of expression, but also under threat with the algorithmic sort of ecosystems that we're looking at. And I think we have to also sort of start thinking about privacy in the same way that we think about freedom of expression, privacy, and personal data protection, because this is sort of the way that people are being targeted. It's the way the speech and advertising, targeted advertising in particular, are sort of helping to produce these kind of rabbit holes of disinformation or hate speech. The things that we engage with most are sort of being promoted because of their more extreme views. They're sort of promoting these more extreme views, and that this is creating not only sort of the proliferation of what some people might call sort of negative externalities of the business models of these platforms, but also preventing people from getting information that they really need in a deliberative democracy. So I guess it's not very good news to say that not only are we contending with sort of the legislative and policy space that we have been talking about all day in the Arab region, but we're also contending with sort of the companies and the lack of transparency that they have around their policies as well. So let's see. And I think, if you don't mind, I'll kind of leave it at that. I mean, there are some things that we can talk about in terms of what some of the policy recommendations might be. Oh, I know what I was going to also talk about is that, so I guess there's the way that we're sort of, or way I'm sort of thinking about this now, and sort of this idea of what's the theory of change, and that there's sort of, I don't think we can expect government policy, legislation, revising constitutions to have much of an impact. I think we have to look for what are the other levers that we have available to us. People definitely, and the protests that we're seeing in Iraq, in Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan this year, and elsewhere, I mean, they're definitely important, but they certainly can't be the only they can't be the only actor. And I think another thing, and Jamal Khashoggi said this in his last interview, which has already been referenced today, but one of the things that was really striking to me is that he sort of said one of our only hopes is if the international community actually stands up and holds the governments accountable for the rights that they have, in many cases, either signed or ratified as signatories and ratifiers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, but they're not, and they're not because of this idea of sort of sovereignty of states, And so I think there are questions that we need to difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves about what does sovereignty mean in a digitally networked age. Can it really exist as the same kind of concept, especially when we're talking about information ecosystems, which are sort of fundamental to everything that we do. And then the third area that I think we need to think more clearly about as a lever for change in the region is using the business and human rights frameworks. I'm really struck at how I have a real sense of cognitive dissonance when I look at the level of investment that's taking place both from Silicon Valley into the region and from the region, particularly the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, into Silicon Valley companies, and there's really very little scrutiny of this. You have editorials, and then you also have problems, for example, where we all hear about China and how China is asking companies not to remove Taiwan from their country list, or the recent problem with the NBA and how there was support expressed for Hong Kong and freedom in Hong Kong. But we never hear about the fact, we don't hear enough or in any sort of depth the fact that Netflix removes its episode critical of Saudi Arabia from that geopolitical market or that geographic market. We don't hear about Snapchat removing Al Jazeera's channel from Bahrain and two other Gulf countries. I can't remember what they are at the moment. iTunes also removed one of their third-party sort of store providers removed songs that they considered critical, although they were actually anti-terrorist sort of thinking songs, because they were worried that they wouldn't be accepted within the legal regime. And what a lot of these companies are doing is using sort of compliance with local law, which does not conform to human rights standards, as a justification for this, because they want to operate in these markets. Not to mention the fact that very few of these markets have anything resembling a data protection law. And so there are questions there about how can you operate according to human rights standards if you're operating without data protection law. Of course, that also happens in the United States. So, but just basically speaking, I think like this idea of using business as a lever and sort of giving more scrutiny to how investments are flowing. I mean, we see in the Saudi Vision 2030, I mean, I think I want to emphasize that these states are thinking very long term, and I don't think that we're thinking long term enough to match them. They're thinking 2030, the Emirates is 2071. They're thinking about becoming huge market makers, and they're thinking about technology investment and military investment as replacement for oil investment, and they're using those revenues. And I think what's going to end up happening, what I'm concerned about, is when I see these small little incursions into our policy space of things being removed, I'm worried that this ends up, when we knit our digital economies too closely together with regimes that do not share human rights values and democratic values, that what will end up happening is those policies, that the bar will be lowered for everyone. And I think we need to really look more closely at that digital economy space, but make sure that we include the human rights with it. It's not just about development.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll start collecting questions. If you have any questions on the cards, please raise your questions and the staff will pick them up. I just want to mention that Ryan Grimm, unfortunately, will not be joining us. He had an emergency and he is not able to be here. He apologizes. I would like to follow up with a question based on what you said, Jessica, to start with. So we've seen this mutual interest relationship between the private tech companies and the authoritarian regimes, especially in the Arab world. Is there a need for an international mechanism to hold both entities accountable? And that's the question for the three of you.
To hold, can you repeat the question?
An international mechanism or an international agency dedicated to this issue to hold both governments and tech companies accountable?
I'm really reluctant to think. There's a conversation going on in the United States right now about whether or not we need an agency for the internet and sort of to help, I don't know, monitor, govern digital space. And I'm really reluctant to think that that's a good idea. I think siloing digital in its own sector is an idea from 2 decades ago. I think everything is digital now. I don't know how you think of what's a data company, what's not a data company when everybody's collecting data. So I'm sort of instantly allergic to the idea of an international agency trying to like manage the space and hold accountable, especially given that many of our international institutions can't hold states accountable anyway. But I do think that we could sort of try and maybe affirm that that the human rights that we've set out 70 years ago now, and I think there's a reaffirmation that needs to take place, and I think it's, you know, I see so often in government sort of positioning of the internet as like we're trying to make people safe and secure online and we're trying to grow our digital economy. But there's really not very much space for sort of thinking about how do we ensure a deliberative democracy? How do we ensure the values of deliberative democracy? It's always sort of like we want to be safe in digital economy, but of course we want to protect freedom of expression. But so I think there needs to be a reaffirmation at the international level and also among democracies that this is, you know, that we believe in these are the values we believe in. We believe that they should exist in the online space, and that we should use, frankly, the international human rights framework that we have to hold companies accountable. And I think companies should adopt the international human rights frameworks for their content moderation policies and their policies in general. And that doesn't necessarily preclude, you know, also having the First Amendment, but it as, you know, maybe a more expansive policy, but it definitely sets a baseline for what should be, and prevents this idea of complying with local laws that are fundamentally at odds with human rights and democratic values.
Okay. And I will follow up, and I'll give Karen and Mark the chance to answer this as well. It's a related question from back at Columbia University. Kind of a suggestion, I think, as well. Do we need a cybersecurity convention to standardize norms around cybersecurity issues? And it's a similar related question. Karen?
Well, I think that I was going to talk a little bit in my time about the Christchurch Call, because in some ways it has a similar theme. So essentially, in the wake of the mosque shootings, the New Zealand government basically released a plan to combat terrorism and online violent online content called the Christchurch Call. I don't know if you recall, but the massacre was intentionally live streamed and disseminated on social media, and it was really an incredibly dark moment for Facebook and for all people, I think. And so I think that the call calls for there to be some consensus around how to remove online hate speech and violent speech. And about a couple dozen countries have signed on. The U.S. has not, citing freedom of expression and freedom of the press issues. But it basically calls on governments to commit to, you know, strengthening the resiliency and inclusiveness of society. So in some ways, it gets at trying to address why there is hate speech and why there is, you know, calls for violence. I think that a lot of times we look at technology and we, you know, because it's the delivery mechanism, we're looking at technologists and companies and government laws that would dictate to them what they should and shouldn't do as the answer, when it would be nice to see there be a lot more focus on sort of the social and cultural issues that are leading to these kinds of, the tolerance of hate speech. We have a terrible problem with that in this country, and I think in other countries as well. So, I have my doubts about whether, there could be any kind of, international body or even an agreement, as to what should be encompassed in that. And there's one example that I would also give, here at the U.S., because there's there are a lot of proposed bills that are coming out of Congress that are trying to get at this whole idea of internet censorship and whose voices are being silenced online. And some of these proposals are basically at the very core of what they are, would put the government in charge of deciding, what is acceptable speech online. And I mean, it just goes against everything in the First Amendment. So I think that if we were to go down that path, there'd be a lot of really bad ideas that would come out of it.
Mark, would you like to address this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm generally in agreement with what Jessica and Karen have said. I do, however, think, there's a bit of a paradox. If we say that certain international bodies or regulations wouldn't be effective in combating these things, then what harm does it have to have them? Well, maybe they would be effective and it would be harmful. But at the same time, I think we need to reevaluate how we perceive social media companies, in my view. I think there's a normative assumption that things like Facebook and Twitter fundamentally are somehow this good and useful platform that are being misused. Well, what we have to do, I think, is just actually view them, how they're used in their context. Maybe in the US with the Constitution and protections of free speech, that's fundamentally a good thing. But increasingly in the Middle East, they are a platform, a delivery system for propaganda and misinformation. That doesn't mean that they're not used for people trying to use them for freedom of speech. Of course not. But at the same time, what is the context that they are used in the Middle East? I would say increasingly it is a very detrimental manner in which they're being used. And I think you could have more corporate accountability on how these platforms are utilized. I mean, the examples were given of how, Netflix removes a show, the Patriot Act, because it doesn't comply with Saudi law. And then, yes, Saudi laws are not in line with lots of human rights laws that they should be. Why are social media companies that are headquartered in certain countries allowed to operate in countries that have been, aren't party to certain human rights agreements, have a track record of human rights abuses, and have a woeful record on freedom of speech? Why is that allowed to happen? I mean, because that's something you could probably legislate on a domestic level. So even before we talk about the international kind of aspect of it, why can't that be done? You could expect a certain amount of due diligence from these companies before they're allowed to operate in other countries. There's a campaign now to get Twitter MENA removed from the UAE. UAE has a terrible record of treating its dissidents and stifling free speech. So why can't we address that problem? Just as we have conventions to regulate the arms trade, again, many of which are kind of circumvented and laws are subverted, but they exist. We're talking about the weaponization of social media. The word weapon is key. We can't use that word and not talk about things like arms, right? It's the same problem. So yeah, I think there can be some sort of legislation, whether on an international level or a domestic level, that could actually force companies at least to be mindful of the situations in which they operate. And we can't just assume that these tools are somehow good and we should let them do what they want and then maybe have these other caveats. No, we need to actually see how they're being used and then legislate accordingly.
Thanks. And speaking of weapons, we have a question from Dakota from Georgetown. How does attribution and misattribution of cyber attacks by governments, for example, impact regional relationships? Does anyone?
How does it what?
Attribution and misattribution of cyber attacks impact regional relations and conflict.
Oh, that's a goal. That's a.
Well,
Anyone would like to try that?
That's an Emirati goal.
I mean, I could attempt to answer that quickly. I mean, I think what we saw certainly in the Gulf crisis in 2017 was that the Qatari government accused someone of hacking its new systems. Eventually, there was multiple competing claims about who was behind it. Initially, I think some U.S. intelligence operatives said it was the Russians. Then the Egyptians were mentioned, and then the Emiratis, and then the Saudis were mentioned. So I think misattribution or deliberate misattribution or tactical misattribution is designed to kind of follow along existing policy lines. So I think if you accuse someone of hacking, your news company, you're already in an acrimonious state with that other party, right? So I think in the context where we know these attributions take place, they already follow foreign policy like lines. So I don't necessarily think it's too untoward or particularly controversial. But other than that, yeah, I'm not entirely sure to us.
Anyone else? Okay. We have a practical question from Kathleen Davy Mystery, I believe. Is there a list published online that gives people interested a list of what media is allowed or prohibited, social media, specifically WhatsApp, Twitter, etc., in Arab countries?
I don't know of any list. It also changes relatively, I mean, maybe not as frequently as it did sort of immediately after the revolution and during the Syria conflict. For example, before the Syria war, sort of like around 2011, I think, when it first started, it was interesting. One of the things that Syria did was open access to Facebook, and a lot of people assumed that was because they wanted to sort of be able to monitor conversations, and that's a tactic that's been used. I don't know of any lists that actually, but there are, sorry, I'm trying to get back into the directory of my head that says there are tools. One of them, I think, is Herdict, if I'm not mistaken, that will allow you to test whether or not, and other sort of measurement tools that will allow you to test whether or not a site is blocked in a certain country, but it doesn't work for all countries. It depends on whether or not the people who run the site, and I think that's the right one, but I'm not sure, actually have access to a server in that site and can do whatever the technical sort of pinging that needs to be done to see if sites are up online or not. Yeah, I don't know of any comprehensive list that does that.
I think Citizen Lab, they were looking at what was being filtered by NetSweeper, which I believe was a Canadian company, which filtered at certain websites. So I think they started curating a list of sites that were blocked in specific countries using NetSweeper.
Yeah, I think Citizen Lab is where they used to have like we've worked with them on something like that before, but I don't know if they actually post like lists.
Yeah, I don't know if it's real time or updated.
Yeah.
There are some. Often these kind of things, in my experience, are on a country by country basis, and it's often activists who are keeping tabs of these lists. So it's, if you're interested in a specific country, you have to tap into the activist network, and you'll probably find it. I know with Bahrain, it was always used to be on this kind of old school style blog where they'd keep a track. They keep a track literally of things that you couldn't access.
Yeah.
All right, we have a couple of related questions about state and non-state actors getting involved outside of their own states, especially through social media. And there's a question about disinformation campaigns by China and Russia around the world, but also specifically whether we've seen that happen in the Arab world as well, and especially in places like Libya, Yemen, Syria. Mark, do you want to start?
Sure. We know that there's been Russian disinformation active in Turkey, Syria, and to an extent Libya. But attribution is also a problem here. I think that there obviously is Russian disinformation. I think we tend to have, there's an assumption often, and I think it goes back to the Cold War paradigm of how we view international relations, that if there's some sort of sophisticated or even crude cyber attack, either the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese must be involved. And maybe there's some expertise down the line. But I think what was interesting about the Gulf crisis, what it showed us is that with the kind of massive assemblage now of private security firms, entrepreneur hackers out there, it's very easy for states to get hold of people who have these expertise, who are willing to work and conduct either hacking operations or propaganda operations on behalf of a state. So I don't think it's always wise to be looking at state-centric actors in this sense. I mean, what we saw certainly in the Arab world, and although I cautioned against relying on what Twitter say to be a barometer of the level of disinformation, recently, about a month ago, Twitter dumped loads of what they said were political spam accounts. They dumped about 4,500 accounts that they said had been promoting various aspects of propaganda. And I looked into it, and you know, most of these accounts had been criticizing the Iranian role in Yemen, criticizing the Houthis, criticizing Qatar, also sort of promoting the Saudi line on the Jamal Khashoggi affair. But the majority of these accounts were at least based coming out of the UAE, right? Which again, as I mentioned before, is where Twitter MENA is based. So there's a certain amount of irony there. So I think what we have to do is although we have to acknowledge that, you know, Russia does play a role, and it certainly probably plays a role in providing some expertise in these levels, we need to maybe focus less on the role of things like Russia and China in this sphere, because I think there's a lot of in-house or in-regions activity that's kind of doing this. I mean, to go to the Russian example, I mean, one of the most pertinent cases was Sudan recently. There was M1, which was a mining company that was, CNN saw documents that this company had sort of gone beyond their remit of looking into mining, and was basically promoting a campaign that sought to discredit the protest movement by saying it was against Islam, they were pro-LGBT, and that they were violent, which is the classic kind of tropes. So we do know that there's very strong evidence to say they are existing, but they're certainly not the only player in the game. And I think if you're looking for Russian influence in these disinformation campaigns, you've got to look at Russian trade interests. We know Russian investors are looking increasingly more into the Gulf, both in terms of selling their missile systems to Saudi, but also potentially investing in Aramco. I think it's logical to say where Russian trade interests go, their disinformation goes, because they attempt to, one of the tropes of the Russian disinformation campaigns in media, in Africa in particular, is to discredit rival powers, whether it's the US or the French, right? So this accompanies their kind of trade campaigns in order to push out, or at least discredit a lot of their potential rivals. So I think it's a perfectly plausible thing, but they're not the only players in the game.
I would just quickly add, and again, that this idea of just looking, I mean, I think there's something that also goes on where, so there was a revelation, was it early last year, 2018 in January, of a sort of a Lebanese state-sponsored, we think, sort of attempt to create clones of apps that people would have on their phone, and sort of like, and so instead of downloading WhatsApp, you got a link that was sent to you like, hey, download this app, and it would go to something that looked like WhatsApp or another application, and you would download it, and your phone is owned after that. And Lebanon, basically, we think, from the report, which was actually produced by EFF, is that public?
It is.
Okay. Sorry. You know, like in the basement of General Security, apparently there are some people, at least that's what the geolocation of the IP address said, like, you know, there's this small state, Lebanon, who is sort of testing out what its like surveillance capabilities are, because these tools are so easy to get. You have, you know, you hire some people who have good hacking skills, you pay them, they create these things, and they had collected information on people from, I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but 80 different countries.
20 different countries.
20 different
yeah.
countries, maybe, you know, I think several hundred individuals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's not just Russia and China or Iran. You know, their aspirations are kind of contagious to smaller states who have also been introduced to organizations like Hacking Team and others, and sort of have these aspirations of also being able to conduct this sort of activity and surveillance. And so it is that we need to think, I guess the point of all of that is that it's not, I don't know what the point is, except that like this does happen, and it's small states, large states. It's not just sort of the usual suspects, and And so there are things that we should be thinking about on a more fundamental level that requires us to sort of protect our public sphere in a way that I think we're sort of missing the point sometimes.
If you want more information about that Lebanese example, our report was called Dark Caracal, and you can find it on our website. It was done by EFF and researchers at a firm called Lookout.
Okay, we have a question from Elizabeth. She says most current discussions about digital rights and censorship are pretty elite or niche. How do we get this knowledge to a wider audience, including the vulnerable people? And I would add to that maybe a question of how these disinformation campaigns have kind of distorted the notion of what is fact and what is truth online. And for the consumers, it's become very difficult to distinguish. And I would like to ask you to further ask you about the issue of media literacy. Do we have enough media literacy among consumers of social media?
So the last part was about media literacy, and the first part was about
how these discussions are elite somehow.
elite. Okay.
To get
So-
this
and
knowledge
how
out.
do you get
to-
the
yeah.
knowledge out? So no, there's not enough media literacy. There definitely needs to be more media literacy, but I think, so I've worked in the development space for a long time, media development, where money comes from rich Western governments into sort of development organizations, media organizations, journalist organizations in my region, in Lebanon, the Middle East. And, there's a lot of potential good that can be done, but then also, it's never enough. So, and it's usually when you're talking about media literacy for adults, let's say it's probably a little bit later. I think this is something that should be integrated into sort of elementary education from a very early age, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Just like fact checking, of course we need fact checking, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. We're never gonna solve what some people might refer to as a disinformation crisis through fact checking. And on the disinformation piece, I think one of the questions that I continue to have is, what are we aiming for? What are we actually trying to achieve in the disinformation space? Is it the elimination of disinformation? Is it, I still am not clear on a lot of the efforts regarding disinformation, which I think often gets ascribed to social media and the internet and not to the actual people who are creating it, which are sometimes often states. I think there was a report recently on 70 disinformation campaigns that were run by states or people who are very closely aligned with states, political parties, and others who already have political power. So that's kind of so in terms of getting it out to people, I think yes, they are very elitist discussions. However, I think what I've seen is that, for example, the WhatsApp attacks in Lebanon that has sort of sparked, not the reason for, but has certainly sort of sparked the current protests. A lot of the ways that people are responding is by holding digital security clinics and helplines, and so these moments of organizing are often very good times where you do see the spread of this information on a peer-to-peer basis. It's not something that can really be architected necessarily by the development community, although probably some of those people who are passing this information along, you could probably trace back to the source of some of these kinds of, digital activism or digital safety or digital security kinds of trainings and things like that. I really think there's no better way to spread this kind of information than for people to be organizing themselves and need it. So it's often in reaction to something like that. It creates a critical moment.
Karen?
Well, I agree that the discussions can be elitist, and there does need to be more done to involve people of all communities. At EFF, we have a somewhat new organization, a part of the organization called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is goes out. It's communities around the country outside of the big, the big media centers, and the aim is to try to get more communities involved in, digital rights and advocating on the ground in a grassroots way for digital rights. I think that when it comes to some of the arguments that we tend to make about how fighting hate speech and other kinds of speech ends up having consequences on marginalized communities, that's it's sort of with that in mind that we advocate for a more measured approach, because there's been a lot of hue and cry about who's is it conservatives, is it who's getting kicked off of Twitter and who's getting there's a certain I don't know. There are people who can always find their audience because they have the resources and they have the mechanisms to just move from social media to some other social media platform, or to television, or to radio, or but that's not true for a lot of people in communities that are trying to use the internet to stay in touch, form community, educate themselves. And so the arguments or the debates about whose voices are shut down, I think there's not enough attention being paid to the fact that it has a tendency to affect people who don't have the power to find another way to be heard. And I think that's especially true on the international front when you're talking about areas of the world where Facebook is the internet. I mean, Facebook is the way that people communicate with each other. It is the way that news is disseminated. And when you're getting your, news reports, or your, like I talked about before, your, videos that are providing, evidence of war crimes, when you're getting those shut down, it sends a terrible message, and it's very unfair, uneven application of censorship and content mediation.
Mark, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, when I worked for the NGO Bahrain Watch, I mean, I do agree there's high-level discussions of things like digital rights, but they do transfer down. But the thing is, it needs to be well-resourced, it needs to be context-dependent. How people use the internet in one country or platform in one country will differ vastly from another. Again, when I was Bahrain Watch, we did a lot of work when we got funding, and this is another issue that, the elephant in the room is like, how are these initiatives funded? We did a lot to try and raise issues about the dangers of using Twitter. But then we also found that the problem is one of the things that was celebrated about such platforms is allow people to communicate. And once people become more aware of the dangers of them, the trust that is necessary in any deliberative democracy, if that's what we're talking about, also vanishes. So there's also downsides to some aspects of media literacy and how we use certain things. But I would say it does happen. In my limited experience, I suppose, working with an NGO, though, it can be very under-resourced, and it's reactive. Jessica mentioned Lebanon. The things that will be happening in Lebanon now will be different from what happened in Bahrain or Tunisia 5 years ago. The issues, the technologies will be different. The tactics being used by the regimes to control them will be different. So you constantly need someone or some group of people who are adaptive in reacting to these situations, and that requires some degree of resources. And often the people, if it's not just activists doing it, often people doing are, they're getting funding from NGOs. It's pretty scarce and limited and temporarily kind of restricted. So I would say that this is something that can be resourced more, and it does exist. It's just sometimes it feels like an uphill battle, I think.
And speaking of evolving technologies, I'll just pose the last question, and then I will let you add what you like. And this is a topic that Ryan Grimm was supposed to talk about, so I would like to make sure that we touch on that a little bit. And it's the issue of, cyber war, and whatever that could include, cyber attacks, cyber espionage, surveillance, and so on. How worried should we be about the future of the Arab world with new advancements in technology? And feel free to add your closing remarks.
So I'll say I think we should be very worried, because I think a lot of, going back to sort of what I was talking about in the Gulf, in my opening remarks is that the Emirates is sort of, and Dubai in particular, is positioning itself as sort of like the hub of smart cities development, for example. And, and I think it's in the Saudi 2030 vision, it's in an Arab League digital strategy document that I'm not sure is public now, but the Arab League put together a digital strategy, and everything is smart, 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 smart. And every time I see the word smart, I replace it with the word surveillance.
Absolutely.
And so that's very concerning to me. The fact that, like, in I can't remember I could look it up, but the exact story. For example, in the Emirates, they're trying, traffic accidents are a big problem. People drive too fast, big cars, et cetera. And one of the things that they have also is sort of traffic cameras that are, observing people. They also have facial recognition on buses to sort of be able to monitor whether or not a bus driver is tired. But, when you realize also that in the Emirates, 80 to 90% of the people are migrant workers who have really very few rights, then you start to worry, what does that do to the marginal, how does that marginalize people further? And there was one thing with this said that they were using, and I can't remember what the technology was, but or probably some sort of predictive policing that had helped them detain 400 and something suspects, like at a perfect 100%, which we all know is just not possible. So this is sort of like really dystopic, sort of futuristic uses of technology. I think another thing that we're going to start to see across the region is the implementation of biometric digital ID systems, where they can very easily institutional protections and data protections and independent institutional protections and independent judicial sort of processes. You start to see people, that these systems can very easily be co-opted and corrupted for surveillance purposes and other sorts of oppressive tactics. So and the problem is that the international system is helping to implement these things. The World Bank is giving Morocco $100 million in loans to be able to implement a digital ID system over several years, but without thinking about what are the human rights protections there. And PricewaterhouseCoopers is writing the reports on it and doing the consulting. And so our problems are not really, in my opinion, at the layer of, sure, misinformation, disinformation is a problem, but our problems and what needs to be solved is really at a much greater layer, and will require us to ask difficult questions about what do we really value in life and in the world and in the societies we want to create, and what are we willing to question, like the sovereignty of countries to be able to abuse their people. So that's the dark side. And then to go back to the question, and I'm sorry that I forgot to say this before, on the media literacy and how do you spread this. There is a hopeful side, and it's probably still a very asymmetrical fight, but I just wanted to mention that my former organization, SMEX in Lebanon, has started hosting an event. Last year was the first year, this year is the second year, called Bread and Net, Khubzunet. So bringing back sort of this idea of the economic thing, but then also the networking part. And it's a 3-day conference that brings together people who are working, either digital rights activists or others who are sort of looking at Arabic content online. And speaking of Arabic, one of the things that makes this event special is it is in Arabic, which most of the digital sort of security kinds or digital kinds of events are not in the language of the region. And so Bread and Net is in the language of the region. There's English and Arabic, but mostly Arabic. And it's people talking about independent journalism. It's people talking about surveillance, about AI, and bringing all this together. And to my knowledge, it's really the only sort of place in the region where this kind of event is happening in a social justice and human rights kind of context.
That's good to know. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that the technology holds great promise, and it also has really done us in a lot of ways. And I think that I think that the problems that the Arab world is facing are the same that we've faced here, and we haven't fixed, or we haven't done a good job of protecting people and giving users more rights over their digital lives. I think that that's sort of where things should start. And, I don't think that these tech companies and social media companies, I don't think they have enough experience in the Arab world. I don't think they know enough about it. I don't think that they know enough about the language. I don't think that they have enough expertise or people consulting them, and they certainly don't have, to my knowledge, enough input from civil society and human rights organizations in order to help them balance the obvious pressure that they are getting from governments and regimes to, censor certain kinds of speech or disallow certain kinds of people, or to use their own platforms, using these platforms to target speech that the governments don't like. So, and absolutely the surveillance technologies, whether it's facial recognition, the biometrics. I think Dubai is the first, and Emirates is the first airport and airline that's going to be using facial recognition as a means for check-in. These are, so the technologies that, these are sanctioned it's a sanctioned system by the American Customs and Border Patrol. And, I don't think anybody knows where those scans are going, or how long they're going to be kept, or who's going to have access to them. And I read I was reading some reports about it, before, in preparation for this talk, and what I saw was that when asked about, well, do you know how long these images are going to be kept? The response was, well, this is being done under the auspices or with the help of the CPB, the Customs and Border Patrol. And I just would argue that that wouldn't give me a lot of hope, or that would be something that I would find a bit alarming. And so I think that the more that countries have unfettered ability to influence tech companies, and the more that tech companies allow themselves to be influenced because of the riches that they could garner from being in the region, it presents a problem that must be addressed.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I'm generally more cynical, as you might have guessed. But I think I'll speak more to disinformation, I suppose, and propaganda and controlling the narrative. But one of the things, obviously, that we have to bear in mind is the delocalized nature of much of this disinformation. As Jessica and Karen mentioned, countries like, the UAE are positioning themselves, using their vast amounts of wealth to position themselves as a lead player, not just in creating smart cities, but creating a surveillance apparatus in collaboration with the Israeli companies, for example, in order to not just probably spy on their own population, but to export that capability around the world. What I see on social media is that, unlike, if we look at the evolution of media ownership models from having newspapers that were generally more national-centric to satellite channels that were then regional, we saw countries like the UAE and Saudi buying up the satellite infrastructure in order to help dominate the message, kicked out BBC Arabic, for example, because they didn't like that they had the power to do that. Now what? I mean, we see, at least the second largest shareholder in Twitter was a Saudi prince. We see, again, that was mentioned before, SoftBank, Saudi investments in Silicon Valley. But if we actually just look at the operators of the platform, I've done now a study of Twitter users in the Arabic Twitter sphere. If you look at the amount of all verified users on Twitter, the vast majority are in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. If you look at the amount of content produced by Arabic language news accounts or accounts that market themselves as either a news account or a journalist account, the vast majority, by a huge amount, is Arabic language content produced from accounts that have a location or inferred location in Saudi Arabia. And so what we have to remember that's key about the Arab world, whilst not everyone's Arabs, and these countries are different, Arabic language is still, and Fusha, modern standard Arabic, is still spoken across lots of these countries. So if you're a country that is able to dominate the dissemination of information in a specific language across a specific platform, across a specific region, and you're not bound by borders or other information controls, you in theory have the ability to project your influence beyond your borders. And if you're a country that is fundamentally authoritarian, censors its own press, and has a kind of toxic foreign policy, and then you're exporting that, that is a huge problem. And we've seen that. I mean, and I want to end now just with one example, because it relates again to Jamal Khashoggi. Is I did a study on, in October, the October when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, I decided to look at every Arabic country that had Twitter trends and to see whether Khashoggi's name was mentioned in all of those countries, right? So the idea being that, well, if his name is trending in one of these countries, it's a bit like having a newspaper headline. At least it's getting some sort of prominence, right? So I counted, I can't remember, it's 8 or 9 Arabic countries that have this Twitter trending ability. And I looked at an archive of Twitter trends. And I found that the country where Jamal Khashoggi's name was mentioned the most was Qatar, which is not surprising because this was the Gulf crisis, and obviously the Qatar, Al Jazeera was using this instance to kind of highlight how authoritarian Saudi Arabia was. Yet the country it trended least was Saudi Arabia. And some of you may be like, well, maybe Saudis are too scared to tweet on it. But Saudi has the largest Twitter population in the Arab world. But what's more is when I actually looked at the content of one of these hashtags, Jamal_Khashoggi in Arabic, about 3 million tweets, I ranked the tweets according to the most popular. The vast majority of the content in that was pro-Saudi side of the story. So we know for like the first 10 days of October before Saudi admitted that they had killed him, we knew, obviously, in retrospect, that they were lying. So the vast majority of content was actually pro-Saudi. The vast majority in locational data, user-reported locational data on those tweets was Saudi Arabia. So it was really interesting to me that of all the Arabic language content, whilst Jamal Khashoggi had trended the least in Saudi Arabia, the majority of information in Arabic about Jamal Khashoggi's death was that reflected Saudi propaganda. Yet this was not reflected in Twitter trends or anything like that. So I think we have a lot in the way of trying to interrogate algorithms and interrogate Twitter trends to see actually what's going on. But we also have to be worried about who has the ability to dominate the kind of social media information sphere going forward. And at the moment, it doesn't appear to be a rosy picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Before we move to the final minutes of today's conference, the closing remarks, I would like to thank our panelists this afternoon. Thank you for being here. And for these very interesting and worrisome discussions. Thank you all for sticking around. I would like to close by just trying to summarize a little bit of the highlights from today. In the last few years, cyber geopolitics have taken different shapes and forms in the Arab world, and they have become a rapidly growing trend in Middle East politics. And our speakers today did a great job of giving us an in-depth look into these phenomena and the future prospects of cyber politics. What was perhaps the most unique aspect of today's conversations is the alarming nature of the problem I've heard the word alarming and urgent a few times today. And the urgency with which the discussion was framed, specifically with regard to freedom of expression and the future of cyber war. One of the speakers said the most important priority in the Arab world today is the preservation of adequate space for expression. And I think to that end, I would like to highlight three main takeaways, the first of which reflects that, and it's the importance of free press and the freedom of expression for democracy. It cannot be stressed enough how having these tools ensures a healthy public sphere where issues of public concern are subject to discussion, scrutiny, and independent debate, which are necessary preconditions for democratic governance. And yet, we continue to see, as we've heard throughout the day, the suppressions of these freedoms to the point of murder of journalists and dissidents, and with little accountability or mechanisms to address this alarming trajectory. One of the keynote speaker this morning said, any aspirations for justice, human rights, and democracy is directly attached to the media. And the media has the capability to expand democratic possibilities. And so we have to continue to make that a priority. Second, new media tools and platforms present both opportunities and risks. And I think one of the speakers referred to them as a double-edged sword. But it seems more and more so that they have become more part of the problem than the solution, as the structures and the dynamics of power in the Arab world and by authoritarian regimes transfer over to control over media and social media narratives and debates. And we still have outdated and repressive laws like the cyber criminal laws that were mentioned that do not adequately address those challenges. Third, and finally, the issue of cyber politics and cyber warfare is continuously evolving, and it's a growing dangerous trend, especially with the lack of international rights agencies and efforts that ensure the respect for human rights, freedom, and democratic principles in the cybersphere. And it seems like this is just getting started. These tools have low economic and political costs, and they're coupled with a high damaging potential. These cyber capabilities are increasingly being used in geopolitical competitions in the Arab world and elsewhere to violate rights and escalate conflict. Without implementing measures to ensure accountability and ethical policies in cyberspace, the outcomes can be greatly damaging. And I think here is just the main takeaway, which is the primary message from today, has to do with the issue of accountability, or the lack thereof. Accountability to implement existing policies, to enact new needed policies and laws, and to ensure the protection of freedoms and rights. The lack of accountability has been mentioned several times throughout the day as the greatest challenge to progress towards human rights and democracy in the Arab world. And this is one of the important issues that we work on at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It's part of our mission to provide these perspectives that emphasize on human rights, democracy, and civil liberties, and just and peaceful resolution to conflict. We invite you to continue to follow our work at arabcenterdc.org, and we hope to see you at future events. I would like to thank all the speakers that were with us today. Some of them traveled from 14 hours flights and elsewhere to be with us. Thank you for your great contributions and your insightful discussions and conversations. I would like to thank our boards, the Board of Directors, Academic Advisory Board, and the staff of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. For their support, and the staff for doing a great job in planning for this conference. I would like to thank all of you for being here today, for joining us throughout the day, and especially those of you who stayed all the way till the end. I would also like to thank those joining us online. We've been streaming live on our website. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the future. Have a good evening.